Hello, and welcome to God's Just Wanna Have Fun. Before I start, I'm going to issue a heresy warning. This talk will be complete and utter travesty of what most pagans believe. My intention in giving it is not to cause offence, but simply to provoke a re-evaluation of your beliefs. Back in July last year, Robin asked me if I felt like giving a talk at this year's Leaping Hare, and I asked him what he wanted me to talk about, and he suggested theodicy. That's theodicy, not the Odyssey. It's a Greek word literally meaning divine justice. Theos means a god or the god or God, and dike means justice. In fact, to the Hellenic pagans, Dike is a divinity in her own right. She wanders the world with a clipboard, recording all the human wrongdoings and virtuous behaviour, and she reports back to Zeus, who's supposed to follow up by sending back reward or retribution. She's a bit like the elf on a shelf, but universally mobile. So, theodicy, sometimes called the problem of evil in philosophical circles. That is to say, it's a problem for people who believe in gods that are, one, all-powerful, and two, also well-intentioned towards humans. I started working on it. About half an hour later, Robin asked me to give him a working title for the publicity, and then it popped into my head. Who remembers the song and the film Girls Just Wanna Have Fun? For those who don't, the movie is a fairly predictable American high school rom-com in which fortune favours the brave, puts down the rich and presumptuous who cheat at the game of life by using the loaded dice of their social and economic privilege, and good triumphs over evil. You know, the usual kind of happy ending, feel-good plot everybody loves, because in real life it never happens. And as for the title song, the gist of it is that girls just want to be judged by the same standards and expectations as boys for doing what they do. To judge differently, I think you'll agree, is unjust. So why do we do that with gods? Why do we have expectations of them that are higher than the standards we set ourselves? In the next half hour or so, I'm going to be challenging some commonplace notions of divinity and of humanity and of good and evil, and shall be suggesting that we and the gods have more in common than you might think. I shall be taking us through the mists of time and down the rabbit hole of Abrahamic religion, because, after all, Abraham was a pagan. And there is something in the older tradition with which he would have been familiar. And that seems to me a better place to start than the halls of Asgard or the clouds atop Mount Olympus. I propose a single dispersion theory, rather like the out of Africa thing that purports to explain the origins of our species, but which explains the origin not just of us, but of a whole bunch of gods as well. I think different cultures simply renamed them. Anyway, like it or not, and whatever else you may think about it, the Abrahamic tradition is strongly diffused into the present-day culture in which we have to live and cannot ignore, albeit in a form that Abraham himself would have failed to recognize. So, to begin at the beginning. It says in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, which my teacher always used to deliberately miscall the book of the genes of Isis, that the gods made us in their likeness. But by the 6th century BCE, these local gods, who were called the Elohim, local to our solar system that is, got turned into one single supreme being, the creator of the universe. And when you point out to a Christian that Elohim is a plural noun, they'll explain that it means the Holy Trinity. And if you ask a rabbi, he'll say it refers to God and his angels. Yeah, right, they would say that. But the other day, I was talking about exorcism, as you do, and somebody asked me, where would evil be without humans? If knowledge of good and evil empowers the choice between the one or the other, otherwise known as free will, and if you follow the biblical narrative in the 2nd chapter of Genesis, if you take humans out of it for a minute, we're left with another order of beings who are similarly empowered, and these are referred to as the Elohim and the Nephilim, literally they of El and the fallen or descended ones. Personally, I find it unlikely that the Elohim were 100% good and the Nephilim dedicatedly 100% nasty, nor do I think it at all likely that they are two different species. The Bible implies not, the Quran says not. The Zoroastrian Avesta and the Hindu Vedas imply that they are a bit different, but morally, the two latter call these good and evil entities by the same names, but the names of which are evil and which good are in each tradition reversed. Where there's conflict among members of the same species, you find that the enemy is always evil and we are naturally the good guys. Habitually, we humans have always tried to convince ourselves that the enemy isn't really like us at all. We've even tried to make the enemy less than human. Note, though, that the serpent, the leader of the Nephilim in Genesis, who persuaded the first humans to eat of the tree of knowledge, is the only entity in that story that tells the whole truth. Or at least, if he doesn't tell the whole truth, he's the only one who doesn't actually tell a lie at some point. You could say that El merely told Adam and Eve a white lie when he said that the forbidden fruit would kill them if they ate it. And that Shaitan, the enemy, the serpent, told the truth with evil intent, that it wouldn't kill them, but that they would become like the gods. If that leaves you as perplexed as it did me, you might, like me, conclude that we never got to eat enough of the fruit of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil before El ordered his angelic bouncers to turn us out of his garden. What I'm saying here is, in other words, is that the human perception of good and evil is often not clearly defined. Whether or not you think Zarathustra was right, in that there's some kind of cosmic Cold War going on, and both sides have been trying to recruit us individually ever since our creation. When Eve accepted the invitation of the serpent to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she was just a girl, and all she wanted, being a girl, was to have fun. The serpent said it would make her and Adam just like the gods, and that must have seemed like fun too. Adam being a man, and El, the Lord God, being male and in a sense her father, judged her and condemned her to a life of painful subservience. In Genesis 3:16 it says, "To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In sorrow you shall bring forth children, and your desire shall be to your husband, and he shall rule over you." What a bastard! Where's the divine justice in that? Only 3 chapters into the Bible. But if you look at the original Mesopotamian myths that the current Hebrew myth in the Bible comes from, you'll find that there were about 600 of these Elohim who arrived on Earth for no very clear purpose. They were ruled by a council of 6, advising their chief or their project leader, who was called El, or Enlil. Enlil's deputy was his elder half-brother Enki, who the Hebrews later turned into the serpent or Satan, and the Persians into Ahriman, the evil one. Enlil reported to an absentee superior, his father Anu. So, our God of the Old Testament, just like the God of the New Testament, Jesus, was the boss's son. He, Anu, the boss, would look in on Earth very occasionally, but altogether he moved in a pretty mysterious way. In fact, he was the father of both Enlil and Enki, and as far as there was any being who they felt responsible to at all, Anu was the god whom the gods worship. He seems to have more or less let Enlil and Enki get on with whatever it was they were doing on Earth. And initially, what it looks like they were doing was digging irrigation canals to water a ginormous protected plantation, what the Persians call a paradise, in a place called Eden. And this was Enlil's idea. Well, the lesser gods got fed up with doing all the hard labour and put down their tools. In fact, it says they piled up their shovels and pickaxes and burned them, and they went on strike for a more fair division of labour. There were angry words between Enlil and the supervisory grades and the striking workforce, and that escalated into violence, and in the end at least one god, Au-Ilu, the leader of the strikers, was killed. But eventually they made peace among themselves, and they all agreed it would be a pity to waste Au-Ilu's nefesh, his vital essence. So they decided to make human beings out of it, so the humans could do the hard labour instead, and all the gods could just supervise. And that, the story says, is what we humans were here for, cloned and factory farmed from the beginning. No matter what the sheep would like to believe of the shepherd and his dogs, he doesn't have their best interests at heart. He works for a farmer they don't even know about, one who moves, like Anu, in mysterious ways. So, male and female created they them. The new creatures are set to work on all Massa Enlil's plantation, but after a while it begins to get out of hand. It appears that the majority of the 600 or so gods are male, unpartnered, and sexually frustrated. So, as it still says in the Bible, chapter 6 of the book of Genesis, and it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, that the sons of heaven saw of the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. The Babylonian version of this myth says that Enlil couldn't get any sleep for the noise of the multitudes of humans all fucking. So he decided to rub the whole lot out and start again. He was going to flood the plantation and destroy these creatures. He summoned all the gods in council, swore them to secrecy, not to tell the humans what was going to happen. This was not a popular decision. Enlil's half-brother, Enki, kept his oath, but nonetheless managed to warn some of the humans by talking aloud to one of their huts, telling the hut, "Oh, hut, what a shame it will be when you are swept away by the great flood which Enlil has planned, and along with it all the people inside. What a pity it is, O hut, that I, Enki, have been made to swear an oath not to warn the people inside you. to build a bloody big boat and stock it with provisions and bugger off sharpish. I think the rest of the story is familiar to you. It is similar to the story of the Hebrew Noah, of the Greek Deucalion, of the Assyrian Atrahasis, of the Babylonian Utanapishtim. But in the story, Enlil is furious with Enki and those gods who side with him over the fate of the humans. Enki, henceforth known as the enemy or the evil one, walks out of the council of the gods laughing. And he and his followers are, long after Abraham, demoted by a monotheizing posterity to the rank of fallen angel, who you can read all about in a rather misrepresented way in the first and second books of Enoch, or in the Meshech Hares, the black book of the Yazidi faith. Anyway, some humans survived the flood, obviously, along with gods who subsequently went to war with each other, like the Vanir and the Aesir of Nordic myth, the Titans and the Olympians of Greek myth, the Firbolg and the Tuatha De Danann of Irish myth, the Asuras and the Devas of Hindu myth, and the Devas and the Ahuras of Persian myth. And of course the war between Horus and his followers and Set and his. Islamic State, by the way, now calls the Yazidi sect devil worshippers because they venerate Enki as their saviour under the name of Tausi Melek, the peacock angel. That's by the by. Nowhere do I find in anybody's sacred tradition that there is any higher divine authority to whom the gods regard themselves as answerable. During the war between the gods, Anu buggered off and never returned to Earth. We survived that war too, mostly. So did the gods, mostly. They survived to carry on being selfish, manipulative, vengeful, violent, sexually unbridled, but then, as a species, so are we. If we are made in their image, created like them from their essence, how could we possibly turn out to be any different? We can, I believe, number them among our deceased ancestors who are still with us in spirit. Plato, in Book 2 of his Republic, and in his defence of Socrates, said that anyone who believed in the literal truth of the stories about what the gods did in the distant past couldn't possibly believe those gods to be worthy of respect, but rather to be avoided if at all possible. What kind of moral example, he asked, did they offer us? And the horrible conclusion I reach is that the gods of myth and legend had nothing better to work with than themselves. If we didn't make them in our own image, then they made us in theirs. Now I know that some of you at least must be thinking, even if this is generally true, it is certainly not true of every single god, or of every worshipful suprahuman being I know of, or of whose presence or noumen I have encountered. And I agree. I hesitate to say that all the gods we now have are traceable to those 600 odd who came to Earth in the Mesopotamian stories. I have encountered one, for example, who manifests as a horse, and certain others, mostly associated with places and natural features, who aren't at all like that either. At least not during the limited contact I've had with them. Another, whose origins are traceable to one of the 600, and is a confirmed killer of other gods, and who is credited with having long ago skinned one of her divine enemies, head and all, and wore it, and she still keeps it in her wardrobe to wear on special occasions. I found her personable, helpful, and mellow. Perhaps it only goes to show that some of us improve with age. I've met other entities that purport to be the offspring of these gods, and they, I have found, seem benign in vibe and action, and they deliver in response to negotiated requests, doing things for us that we can't. Sometimes, but not always. They're clearly not all-powerful, perhaps not least because they tend to interfere with each other, and their agenda are not the same as our agenda. An old friend of mine, who some of you may remember, once said, "Gods are just like people, really." It was a favourite saying of hers. I would say people are just like gods, really. How could it be otherwise? And you too may, in time, come to be regarded by some pagan posterity as a god, whether as an ancestor or maybe a spirit that haunts a particular place and acts as its guardian. But that will not necessarily make you either deserving of worship or able to fulfill the petitions of the so-called living who pray to you. My upbringing in a spiritualist family long ago convinced me that the mere fact of simply being dead, as it is called, being in spirit, doesn't confer on you a sudden access of wisdom or goodness. If you've ever been to any spiritualist services, you'll certainly be struck by the sheer mind-boggling banality and mundanity of many of the messages that are relayed from the dead to the living. And yet people still persist in legendizing people once they're dead, and the dead rarely disagree with whatever is said about them by the living. So, imagine if right now, while you're still what is called alive, a number of people all agreed that you were a god, and they started treating you as such. Would it make you better or worse as a person? Would it really be good for you? Would it be good for them? Yet people still respond to this ancient yearning to have godlike figures walking among them, mighty men, men of renown, heroes with a special relationship to the deified dead. Perhaps this is programmed into our DNA from the beginning. On his preaching tour of Magna Graecia, St. Paul was worshipped as a god, Hermes. It doesn't just say so in the Bible, and that's Acts 14:12 if you want to look it up. In an excavation of the ruins of Pompeii, an image of him, labelled Paulus, was found in a Roman lararium, a household shrine, along with about 70 other cult images of various gods, heroes, and mighty men of renown. Queen Victoria is regarded as an avatar of Durga in parts of Gujarat in India, as is St. Anthony of Padua as an aspect of Shiva. Prince Philip is worshipped as a god on Vanuatu, and also, of course, the Antichrist has his own cult following in the Republican Party. Well, if being treated like a god, or the offspring of a god is your idea of fun, and that's your karma, isn't it? My notion of fun is to have my own life to lead as I wish, more or less free from the demands and expectations of my fellow beings, and to be held no more responsible for events than any other entity. But you never know how things are going to work out. The ancient gods of Mesopotamia evidently didn't. When the earthiest and most practical of Roman emperors, Vespasian, was in the throes of the enteric fever that killed him, someone came up to him, it was, I think, his son Titus, when he was shitting himself to death, and asked him how he was feeling today. He is reputed to have said, "I think I may be turning into a god." On a bad day, some gods just want to have Imodium. That's all they really want. It's hard when you are an individualized entity that can say, "I am," and mean it, not to think of your own wants and needs first, before those of anyone else's. But you may have children in whom you have invested, with your partner or partners, a part of your vital essence in their making, and you may put their needs before yours, but that is because a part of you resides in them, and when you look at them you see yourself and the beloved, You and the beloved might even be the same person. Or it may be that your beloved or your child or both may be a non-human animal. To a cat, a dog, a horse, whatever, you are a kind of God. And you care about them, you really do, because there is a bond of love, a high-octane, energetic exchange between your vital essence and theirs. But sometimes to them, dogs, cats, kids, the things you do, even when intended by you to be purely for their benefit and at some cost to you, perplex them. You can see their nous trying to work out the mysterious ways in which your nous works, and you, in your turn, try to understand theirs. Now suppose that in the beginning there was just one spirit, one divine nous, a supreme being, and for reasons best known to itself, it didn't want to be alone, and so it kick-started a creation. Out of that, on all the ensouled, intelligent bioplasms in the universe that we call planets, have devolved countless other life forms, all reproducing and affiliating like crazy, because they too like not being alone. Like the Sumerian god El, the supreme being may regret the developments of what it started. But having set the process of creation in motion, and it seems to be continually self-perpetuating and exponentially expanding, it is powerless to stop it, or even do anything about it. It says in the Rig Vedas, the oldest sacred text known to humanity, that it is perfectly possible that even the Supreme Being really doesn't know how it all started, or what's going on, what's happening. The idea always makes me think of that episode in Walt Disney's Fantasia where Mickey Mouse is the sorcerer's apprentice. Imagine a demiurge, a very young demiurge, doing the great rite of creation for the very first time. Now suppose again that you can't make a universe out of nothing. I think that's a fair assumption. You have to use your own vital essence, just as your parents did to make you, and just as Enki and Nintu used the vital essence of Au'ilu, the first trade union strike leader to be executed by the bosses on planet Earth, to make the first humans. That means a spark of that intelligent, primal, divine fire resides in all of us. Gods, humans, dogs, cats, horses, wasps, everything that lives and moves and has its being. For me, this makes best sense of two otherwise rather perplexing passages in the Bible. First is Psalm 82, verse 6. I have said, ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. And then referring to that one, New Testament, Gospel of John, chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law, I said, ye are gods? Imagine how it would be if your living nous, your consciousness, were dispersed into every living creature that exists. No, I can't either, but it's interesting to try. Suppose that each stage of that creation you started, you, the creator, the supreme being, itself creates more and more complex and binding laws, multiplying exponentially from the pure, primal, intelligent energy, the primordial white light or the logos, the word or the mantra that sang it all into being, that knows only one law of two things, grow or die. Develops and devolves and multiplies into what the Taoists call the 10,000 things. giraffes, baked beans, e-cigarettes, Tesco, the Daily Mail, and so on. The more restrictive laws, the more specific and particular templates that exist at the lowest level of creation, this one, the harder it is for the Supreme Being to influence or change what has come into being down here. This explains how a benign God can allow the existence of the Daily Mail. Suppose you are the Supreme Being, remember, that all those tiny bits of your consciousness that found themselves embodied as souls by creatures that can reason, and those that can't, became even dimly aware of the possibility that, in effect, it's like they've been microchipped, and that an intelligence that is not them is sensing the world through their eyes, ears, nose and skin, and reporting every impression back to your cosmic mind that is quite possibly utterly blown by the sheer immensity and sensory overload of it all. It doesn't sound like fun to me. But then omnipresence and omniscience probably aren't any fun at all. And dispersed like that into all those myriads of competitive monads striving with each other all the way down the 7 levels of creation. Many of them actually trying to eat each other, sometimes even while fucking each other at the same time. Omnipotence begins to look like a mere technicality, wouldn't you say? All I can say is, if you're bored and lonely, and all you want is to have fun, it seems that you end up with a whole bunch of other stuff you had no idea was going to happen. And then, some tiny little bits of you on some distant planet in a galaxy far, far away are judging you and saying you can't possibly exist, because if you did exist, you'd be nice and you wouldn't let bad things happen, even though they themselves are not particularly nice and certainly allow bad things to happen. So, spare a thought for the one true God and for those other created beings that you call gods. Because as far as some other created beings are concerned, you are a god too, with responsibilities, who will disappoint. When your cat learns you can't or won't turn the rain off, and your dog can't understand why bringing you a wild rabbit is a good thing and bringing you your neighbour's pet rabbit is an evil thing, or when your children realise that you are not, after all, omniscient or infallible or Father Christmas. Life's like that. For every sentient being on whom expectations are loaded by other sentient beings. Here are a couple more thoughts I'd like to leave you with. That spark of the individualized divine consciousness in us that we call the soul. Perhaps it is that in us that regrets the way things are and wishes they could be otherwise, because it's in complete tune and direct communication with the Supreme Being. It prompts us to do things we instinctively know to be in accord with the divine intention, what we call good, and warns us to avoid those things we intuitively know somehow are destructive. It's evil. If this is so, then perhaps God helps those who help themselves, because the Supreme Being is in us. As Muhammad said, Allah is closer to you than the veins in your neck. Surah 50 of the Quran, verse 16 says, "And indeed we have created man, and we know what his innermost self whispers within him, for we are closer to him than his jugular vein." But one can't always be sure that an action or an event that seems good will turn out to be justified by the results, or vice versa. Look at what the Supreme Being probably thinks. There's a Taoist story of an old peasant who lived with his only son, and they had one horse to help them with the work, a single mare. And one day the mare got out of the corral and she ran off, disappeared, couldn't find her anywhere, went looking, calling, nowhere. And the neighbours, they were sympathetic, they came to visit and they said, "That's terrible luck." And the old farmer said, "Well, maybe, who knows?" A day or two later, the mare came back, and this time she had with her a small herd of wild horses. "Wow!" said the neighbours, "you really were in luck that time. Well done, brilliant, congratulations." "Oh, maybe," says the old man. "Who knows?" A week or so after that, his son tried to ride one of the untamed horses, and it threw him, and he broke his leg. And the neighbours again came to offer their sympathy on his misfortune. They said, "Bad luck, old chap." "Maybe," his father said. "Who knows?" And not long after that, war broke out with a neighbouring state, and soldiers came to the village to draft a levy of young men into the army. And when they saw that lad's leg was broken, they couldn't take him. And then a bit later on, the village learned that in a battle, the army had been badly defeated and thousands killed. The neighbours congratulated the farmer on how well things had turned out in the end. "Maybe," said the farmer, "but who knows? I think we can know this much. We are far better acquainted with what is convenient and what is inconvenient than with what is good for us or bad for us, never mind the rest of creation. Although as a species, it may just be that our thoughts are beginning to embrace the idea that whatever is good for this planet we live on is ultimately far likelier to be better for us in the long run than what is bad for the planet." That's all, folks. Thank you for listening. Normally at a live lecture I would ask if you have any questions and try to answer them. So if you have questions, I'd still like to answer them if I can. So if you have any matters arising that you would like to discuss, you can email me here.